here at the library, and I believe in starting on time, and I've got 7 o'clock. I'm thank you for coming out on a night like this. We didn't really know if this was going to happen, you know, one of these things at the end. Our February talk was postponed twice. We had a lousy Wednesday night, first Wednesday, and we had a lousy second Wednesday night in February. That has been postponed until the annual meeting of the Friends. The Friends of the Library is the organization that essentially funds this series. It's coordinated by the Vermont Humanities Council, but the Friends of the Library pay our share to bring these lectures to you. They have an annual meeting, which is on the first Wednesday, I believe this year, of May. It's going to be in the daytime, and the speaker has agreed to come and speak at the annual meeting. So we get to hear her in nice weather. The topic will be reading, particularly as it relates to gender. And she's going to focus on book clubs as an angle of how reading tends, as she says, to become sort of associated with gender, particularly in the United States. She, I believe, is a sociology professor up at UVM. So she studied this whole thing, and we've been trying to get the word out among the book clubs in the area that this might be a sort of an interesting take on what they're doing. So that's going to happen in May. And if you are not on our sign-up email list, I can pass around a little sign-up thing. We email folks about our programs sort of on an irregular basis. We haven't gotten a monthly program guide yet, but it is as needed. So let me just pass this around. If you would like to get on the list, just legibly write your name and your email address, and then I can just put it on the list for you. Somebody commented on the chairs that you're sitting in tonight. Do you like them? Yeah? Oh, okay. I figured you would. You like the arms. You like the arms. And the width. Okay. We were able to get those chairs. They were donated, and so I'm glad you enjoy those. And now I'd like to introduce Frankie Dunleavy, who is a member of the board of the Vermont Humanities Council. She lives here in town, teaches at the Union High School, and she's going to introduce our speaker this evening. Frankie, thank you.
Well, on behalf of the Vermont Humanities Council, I'm pleased to see so many people here today. Unfortunately, it was a snow day, so I couldn't even offer extra credit to my students to be here tonight, but I would like to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Edward Bradley. Dr. Bradley did his undergraduate, graduate, and doctoral study at Yale University. He taught in the classics department at Dartmouth College for 43 years and founded that department's foreign study program in Italy. He is co-founder of the Classical Association of New England Summer Institute at Dartmouth in the Classical Humanities, which will have its 26th annual offering in July of 2008. His principal areas of instruction at Dartmouth include Latin and Greek language, medieval Latin in Latin, Virgil's Aeneid and Horace's Odes in Latin, epic texts of Greece and Rome in translation, and Greek lyric poetry and Homer in Greek. His current research includes finding instructive parallels between the Romans' conception of their history and destiny and those of the Puritan forebears and the founding fathers of the United States. So please help me welcome Dr. Bradley.
Thank you very much. I'm embarrassed to say that despite having lived in Vermont for the better part of 45 years, this is the first time I've ever been to Middlebury. I don't know what that says about the state, or does it say rather something about me that I probably shouldn't pursue with you further this evening. But I am happy to be here and happy to have made the discovery of this charming town of Middlebury, and I hope tomorrow I arrived at dusk to have a chance to look over the campus of Middlebury College. But I feel horribly parochial in making that admission to you. That's God's truth. Speaking of parochialism, I think that most of us here present this evening are inclined to think above all if we are New Englanders by birth, or certainly by our living here for some time, that the principal influences on the invention of New England, and out of New England we wish to think America. I speak as a New Englander. We wish to think America was somehow invented in New England, then radiated from New England, Pace, Virginia, and other places. We wish to think that it was our Puritan forebears who brought to us that essential understanding of where we came from and what we were to be about. And there is a lot of truth in that. And I do wish to talk about that very briefly at the beginning of my talk. But otherwise, I wish to bring to your attention the fact that there was another ancient people, not quite as ancient as the ancient Israelites, that had a sense of itself as also being a chosen people, like the ancient Israelites. A chosen people predestined for a special kind of role in the course of history, in the case of the Romans, a Mediterranean history, and that these two ancient peoples, with their own sense of divine predestination, divine election, have had an enormous influence on our own sense of being somehow a nation chosen for a special destiny. And what I wish to do with you this evening is demonstrate how this influence from the Romans works its way into the conceptualization of early America on the part of our founding fathers, how it manifests itself, and how, in the course of the centuries since the founding of this nation, and how we continue to live with the, as it were, the resonance of these two influences that come together in a very interesting kind of amalgam to create for this nation a sense that somehow the United States enjoys an exceptional role, nay, has for itself a certain kind of exceptionalism. You may have heard that term, American exceptionalism. So that's what I wish to discuss with you this evening, and I hope that it will generate some questions after my talk. Let's begin first with the Puritan heritage, which is familiar to us living in this state and with our knowledge of what goes on in neighboring states. I wish to draw your attention to the fact that among the Puritan founders of the colonies of Massachusetts and Plymouth, I'm speaking now of John Winthrop and William Bradford, there was a very strong sense that the world that they were going to develop here was determined by covenant, that among our Puritan forebears, the notion of covenant was of paramount importance. I'm quoting now from David Bryan Davis' book, The Boisterous Sea of Liberty, in which he says, and I quote, "A central element in Puritan social and theological life was the notion of the covenant. All social relationships between God and man, ministers and congregations, magistrates and members of their community, and men and their families were envisioned in terms of a covenant or contract that rested on consent and mutual responsibilities." And John Winthrop, in the course of his journey to this country, aboard the ship Arabella in the summer of 1630, wrote an essay entitled A Model of Christian Charity, in which he gives expression to this notion that then began to inform the thinking of those who came with him and were with him as members of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. I quote now, "When God gives us a special commission," this is from his essay, A Model of Christian Charity, "he wants it strictly observed in every article. Thus stands the case between God and us. We are entered into covenant with him for this work. But if we neglect to observe these articles, which are the ends we have propounded, and dissembling with our God, we shall embrace and prosecute our carnal intentions, seeking great things for ourselves and our posterity, the Lord will surely break out in wrath against us and be revenged on such a perjured people, and he will make us know the price of the breach of such a covenant." And he goes on to say, "So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, and 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies. The Lord will make our name a praise and a glory, so that men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like that of New England. Quote, for we must consider that we shall be like a city unto a hill, upon a hill, the eyes of all the people are on us. And he is quoting there, or paraphrasing, as you may recall, Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, verse 14, in which Matthew says, or Jesus says, in Matthew's words, that you are the light of the world, and a city founded upon a hill cannot be concealed. All right? And similarly, may I say that William Bradford, in his History of the Plymouth Plantation, written at about the same time, yes, ma'am?
Excuse me, we can't hear back.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is there something wrong with the microphone, or am I?
The microphone only goes for the camera.
Oh, righto.
I don't have a microphone.
Oh, righto. I'm sorry. Do you hear me better if I speak in this tone of voice, or no? Ma'am, do you hear me?
Yes.
Good, good. Sorry. Well, sorry about that. Yeah, oh, my dear. I thought I had a voice that carried rather well, but one more indication of something that's not what it should be. All right. Well, in any event, that's in addition to my parochialism. In any event, Bradford says, in speaking of Squanto, the Indian who helped them, that, quote, he was a special instrument sent of God for their, referring to the members of the plantation, good beyond their expectation. I'm not going to pursue this further other than to say that the legacy of this way of imagining the foundations of these colonies in New England is, of course, everywhere manifest in these states, and I refer to the fact that in our own Vermont, we have the towns of Bethel, Bethel, house of God, where, as you know, God appeared to Jacob. We have Sharon, a town in Samaria. We have Canaan, not too far away, actually, a little tucked away in the northeast kingdom, which was, of course, the land promised to Abraham. We have as well Newark. That's the one that I think we don't think too much about, but you all know that Newark, as in Newark, New Jersey, is the new Ark of the Covenant. You all knew that. And we have here, as they have in New Hampshire, a Mount Pisgah. I always used to be amused by that, but does anyone know what, in fact, the scriptural or the biblical citation of Mount Pisgah is? It's where Moses was shown by God the promised land in Deuteronomy 34 before he died. So there's a Mount Pisgah here, not too far from St. Johnsbury, in all of its 1,443 feet of splendor. Not too high to see much beyond the area around St. Johnsbury, but enough for it to have been a place from which evidently the promised land could be glimpsed. So we have that. We know that. And I don't want to pursue that further. And as I say, I think we all sense that is what we carry almost in our cultural genes here in New England. And I don't know how you wear that, but I come from a family that's very puritanical, and every time I meet with my brothers, I have two older brothers, it's remarkable how judgmental we are. We just love to judge the world, you know, and I just think that may come out of that Calvinist background. All right. But what we may know less about is that there was an enormous influence upon the founding fathers of this nation coming from ancient Rome. And I wish to dilate on that a little bit right now, and here I will ask you to consult that handout that I've given you, and look at the first sheet, which shows you an image of a dish that was probably a ceramic dish that's in the Villa Giulia Museum in Rome, for those of you who may want to see it in its living presence. It's a dish that was made in great quantities to commemorate a victory by the Roman general Curius Dentatus. Manius Curius Dentatus. You have this on the second, or the reverse side of that first sheet. When he beat King Pyrrhus of Epirus at the Battle of Beneventum in 275 BC. King Pyrrhus of Epirus had come to Italy with 25,000 troops and about 20 elephants, along with their mahouts, as war animals. And Curius Dentatus defeated him. And in commemoration of that signal victory, this dish was made and apparently mass-produced for circulation to the Romans. Incidentally, Curius Dentatus was awarded a triumph for that, and he was seen as one of the great generals of early Roman history. But my point in bringing it to your attention is to indicate to you that already by the early years of the 3rd century BC, the Romans had a sense that what they achieved as a people was part of a larger design than the mere event itself. Now, you want to think in that connection of what you may remember from any course in ancient history you had a long time ago. As I look over this audience, I see that many of you are going to have to think of a long time ago, not all of you, happily, but where you may recall that the Greeks also had signal victories to celebrate. And they did erect trophies, it's to be sure, but they didn't mass produce plates, not unlike, incidentally, coronation cups that the English used to produce whenever a new king and queen were coronated in England. All right? So already the Romans have a sense that what they do is part of a larger design than the mere event itself, that it deserves to be immemorialized. And if you look further on that sheet, this is now items 1, 2, and 3, you will see that one of the earliest Roman poets, Quintus Ennius, his dates are given to you, wrote an epic of Rome that was called the Annales, that is to say an epic text that dealt with the history of Rome on an annual basis. Now, without your having to know anything much about either the Iliad or the Odyssey, if you just know what they were generally about, you will recall that they had nothing to do with any specific events in Greek history. That one of them was about a great warrior and his wrath. The first word of the Iliad is wrath, and about the way in which that works itself out in ways that have nothing to do with any verifiable historical event or individual. And the second, the Odyssey, of which the first word is man, talks about the destiny of a hero and his homecoming from war, but does not relate to any specific event. But the Romans, in their earliest sense of what was appropriate for epic poetry, that is to say, that genre of poetry that treats of the grandest themes, of the relations between human beings and their gods, and the very ultimate meaning of human being. For the Romans, that was rooted in their history. So Ennius wrote the Annals, the Annales, an epic in 18 books, right, of the history of Rome from the fall of Troy right down to his own day. That is to say, from time mythological, prehistoric, and imaginary, the fall of Troy, down to 181 BC. Only 550 lines of this poem survive, alas, although it enjoyed an enormous influence in later Roman epic poetry. May I just add here parenthetically, and I may have a chance to come back to it later, that in our own history, the poet Joel Barlow, who's not a household name I acknowledge, was nevertheless an interesting figure in the late 18th century who wrote an epic poem about the founding of America called The Vision of Columbus, published in 1787, and then revised and retitled in 1807 to become the Columbiad. But his notion was to celebrate the special emergence of America as a nation destined to reconstitute the meaning of peace and progress in the globe, on the world scene. More important, because it survives better, is the text from Cicero's De Republica called the Somnium Scipionis, of which you have some references on that sheet, the final book of his great work, in which he allows the young hero, Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, to have a vision, a dream in which he encounters his famous adoptive grandfather or great-grandfather, Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, that is to say the conqueror of Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in 204 BC, in which his great and illustrious ancestor, one of the greatest Romans ever to have lived, makes clear to him that for those Romans who devote themselves to service to the state, there is a way of achieving some form of immortal life. And you say, well, what's that? How does that relate to your topic here? It's one more sign of a sense that somehow identification with the Roman enterprise, with what the Romans would call their civitas, their national entity, and their native land, patria, is a way of encountering the gods after life, in a way that the Romans really hadn't much imagined before the middle of the 1st century BC. The Romans, may I add, did not have a clear sense of an afterlife at all, certainly down to this time. They did sense that it was important to pay some respect to the spirits of the dead on the anniversary of their death. And those of you who have been to Pompeii or to other places where there are ancient cemeteries surviving will recall that in the little places of burial that belong to rather better, well-to-do people, there are little couches for a kind of funereal banquet which was celebrated once a year to placate the manes, or the spirits of the dead. But by the middle of the 1st century BC, I'm veering from this microphone, excuse me. By the middle of the 1st century BC, the Romans began to develop a clearer sense of an afterlife that was reserved for those who had devoted themselves to their gods, to their family, and to their state. A special kind of relationship that had not been conceived before. Let me go on. This is amplified and brought perhaps to its fullest expression in the epic of Virgil, the Aeneid, which some of you, again, may I just ask, how many of you in high school or in college had some brush with the Aeneid? Good. Oh, good, good, good. All right. Well, you remember it's the great epic poem that celebrates the founding of Rome by a hero who is preserved for a special destiny from the fall of Troy in Homer's Iliad. And in Virgil's Aeneid, as you may know, there are lots of specific intrusions in the poem into current history. That's terribly important. So that if you look at that sheet that begins with item 4, Publius Vergilius Maro, and so on, you will note that I first of all describe or give you the opening lines of his poem, very different from those of the Iliad and the Odyssey, because this is a hero who's chosen to come to a specific place, a real place, that we, the auditors of this poem, I remind you that Roman literature was originally composed to be recited or read aloud to auditors. People did not initially buy books. They were too expensive. So as the auditors of this poem, after it had first been published, we would see this is the poem about someone, a hero from the world of Homer, which we know to have been an imaginary world, but somehow someone coming out of that time, that misty time of the past, enters history to make possible what we are now doing here today in Rome. And lest you think I'm going too far, look at my second quotation, B on that page, where we have in the first book of the poem Jupiter's prophecy saying, for these I set no limits, world or time, but make the gift of empire without end. I've given you the Latin. And then he goes on to describe events that have just taken place in our own, I'm speaking of us as Romans, our own recent history. To wit, the closing of the gates of war. The gates of war were in the Temple of Janus in Rome. They had not been closed and since the year 235 BC. All right? And here now, Jupiter in his prophecy is saying to Venus, but to us as well, of course, that they will be closed, and we know that they were just closed in, first of all, in 29 BC, all right? The poem, incidentally, Virgil died in 19 BC. This was the time the poem was being available for an audience in Rome in the early years of the second decade of the first century BC. The gates of the Temple of War were closed in 29, and they were closed again in 25 BC, and again before 20 BC, just a few years earlier. We're not quite certain of that. So we as Romans see that this poem is about the gods entering history for us. And I could go on in the discussion. This is C of the Shield of Achilles, which comes in Book 8. There are references to specific notable events in recent Roman history, including Augustus Caesar's triple triumph, which was celebrated in 29 BC between the 13th and 15th of August of that year. All right? So my point is that in the Aeneid, and I could go on if we had more time, there are references, specific references to events that are taking place or have recently taken place in our own experience as Romans, and they are events which corroborate absolutely compellingly that we are a people specially destined by the gods for special purposes. Empire without end, incidentally. And I could, in Book 6, where the hero Aeneas visits his father in the underworld, his father actually gives him an injunction about what it is to be a Roman and how it is the Roman mission to rule the peoples of the Mediterranean and to accustom them to the civilizing influences of peace, even as it is also their mission to tame the haughty. And I show in this connection, this is this image from the great Augustan altar of peace, which was dedicated on July 4, 13 BC, and then consecrated on January 30th, 13 BC. It shows the hero of the Aeneid, Aeneas, sacrificing, and right around the corner on this great monumental altar of peace is in fact a procession in which the emperor is depicted as if he were walking around the corner to meet Aeneas. Finally, in the case of the Romans, I turn to Livy. This is your next sheet, item 5. Livy, an ancient historian, a Roman historian, who lived roughly at the same time as Virgil, but lived a little longer, and wrote a great history of Rome that went from, his purpose was to record the history of Rome from its origins down to 9 BC. The first 5 books, which deal with the earliest history of Rome, do survive. They're very interesting. They're very lively reading. And in Book 5, Livy, as is his wont, focuses on a hero. His tendency is to see great figures coming to the fore in times of crisis, to remind the Romans of what they should be doing in concert with the gods in order to effect the higher purposes of Rome as they have been designed by those same gods. And in Book 5, his great hero is a general named Marcus Furius Camillus, a name I've always liked. I guess it's because of the furious part, perhaps. But he is a great general and a great statesman. He was the hero of the capture of Veii, a town 10 kilometers north of Rome, which one can still visit, incidentally. It's a bus ride north of Rome. It's farmland now. It's an incomparable sight. But it was an Etruscan city that the Romans had to conquer if they wished to expand to the north. And in the course of his taking the city of Veii, Camillus instructs his soldiers to pray to Apollo and to the principal goddess of Veii, Queen Juno, to ask her to be willing to abandon Veii for Rome, to bring her divinity, her numinous power, from Veii to Rome. The Romans had a sense that if they could bring gods from elsewhere, import gods, often from their conquered enemies, they would, as it were, garner the supply of divine power as if it were gold bullion. You understand? Numinous power. So it's very important that Queen Juno, as Livy alleges, and nodded when issued the invitation, and there was a grand procession organized by Camillus in which maidens and matrons and so on went out from Rome and carried Juno down, her cult image down to Rome, in a ceremony called a deportatio, to a temple that Camillus built on the Aventine Hill in Rome for her. Then a catastrophe arrived. A few years later, the Gauls invaded Rome in 390, and Rome very nearly fell to the Gauls. Livy's version of this is somewhat adulterated. It's probable that the Romans bought the Gauls off. Right? It's not quite the way he presents it. That's beside the point. He reintroduces Marcus Furius Camillus as the hero of the hour, who, once the Gauls have been defeated and driven off, participates at a dramatic moment in a great debate in the Senate, when the Roman Senate is considering the idea of abandoning Rome and moving to Veii. Now, anyone who's been to Veii, and just if you have an opportunity to, if you're adventuresome, man, I think Vermonters tend to be adventuresome people, and I know you go there, Frankie. Go to Veii and walk. It's just farmland now, and if you're very careful and look down at the fields that if they've been recently plowed, you'll see all kinds of little goodies, little things that the plows keep bringing up. I was once there with a group of students when a set of ancient surgical instruments emerged. I was there once when a grave robber found an Etruscan greave, a votive greave, an ornamental terracotta protection for the knee and the lower calf with a figure of a sun on it, and so on. It was broken, but it had been obviously erected or given in some temple, and he found that, and he was looking at it contemptuously. I said, do you want to sell that? He said, no. But anyway, Veii is an interesting site to explore because it is bounded by water that makes it very nearly impregnable. So the Roman Senate was considering moving to Veii, at least so Livy records. And at this point, Marcus Furius Camillus appears before the Senate and reminds the Roman Senate that Rome is a place in which every single cobblestone, as it were, of its streets somehow enjoys the auspices of the gods. Every street has been auspicated. Now, you may know that the Romans were rather obsessive in their determination every day to determine the will of the gods by sending an augur, a religious official, onto the Capitoline Hill with his staff, his lituus, in which he stood in a certain way and aligned his lituus with a mountain to the south called Monte Cavo, all right? Got a sight line. And on the basis of the flight of birds over or back, he would determine whether the auspices were good or not. Do you see? So Livy says there's not a street in Rome that has not been auspicated. That is to say, somehow divinely protected. If you leave this city, you will leave those gods who have protected you. I've given you the quotations there that I don't need to read in your presence, although I'm tempted to, I say, but I won't. What I will say is that at the conclusion of his speech, the Roman senators are awestruck and hesitant. And at that point, a small detachment of soldiers, led by a centurion, is overheard to come in front of the Senate. And the centurion says, it's a changing of the guard. And the centurion says to the soldiers and to the standard bearer, the fellow who's carrying the little standard, he says, standard bearer, you can see this in Latin, those of you who want to revive a little of your high school Latin, statue signum, put the standard down here. I would observe that the word signum in Latin means also a sign or a portent in addition to meaning a standard, a little battle flag. And then he concludes, hic manebimus optime, here we shall best remain. Well, you have to imagine that the senators, through the open doors, quivered with a sense of divine of a kind of divine voice coming through that of the centurion. And they knew this was a portent which they should heed, and they agreed to stay in Rome, and we know that from there on, Rome prospered, all right? Livy makes very clear to us his notion here. These are the last two quotations at the bottom of the page, which I will remind you to look at closely. He says, in talking about Camillus and all that, quote, "But I must believe it was already written in the book of fate that this great city of ours should arrive and the first steps be taken to the founding of the mightiest empire the world has known, for," as he has Romulus explain shortly thereafter to representatives of various neighboring peoples with whom the Romans wished to marry, quote, "In the course of time, helped by their own worth, sua virtus, their own valor or courage, and the favor of the gods, some cities, at least, would grow rich and famous, and of these Rome would assuredly be one. Gods had blessed her birth, and the valor of her people would not fail in the days to come." Enough about Rome. Enough about Rome, at least from my purposes. We may want to come back to this. What I've chosen to emphasize with you is that the Romans, like the ancient Israelites, also had a very clear notion of their having been chosen to enjoy a special mission in the world that they knew, in the Mediterranean world and beyond. All right? They were a chosen people, a people chosen by their gods, not by God as the ancient, or Jehovah as the ancient Israelites had seen. Well, I don't think that we pay all that much attention to the Roman background in our own founding, but it is one that was of enormous influence, as those of you who may have read David McCulloch's John Adams will know. John Adams was a great classical scholar. So was Thomas Jefferson, may I say. Less so perhaps than Adams, whose favorite writer was Cicero. He loved Cicero. It's a great book. And if you haven't read that book, it's one of those books that, as Americans, I think we should read. They're books. I find a book every year that I have 4 sons, and grown sons. And I try to find a book that I give to them, the same book, every year. And that was one for a few years ago. That was, it was the book of the year a few years ago. Just a book that, boys, don't, I know you think, Dad, read this book. Read this book. Just as a Team of Rivals. I don't know how many read Team of Rivals. I think that's a great book as well. That's a great book for Americans to read. Anyway, so much for the Romans, but now I want to look at how then that influence came to bear on the thinking of the founding fathers. John Adams, I've already referred to him. It's interesting to note that in a letter written to his son, John Quincy, when John Quincy was a student at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands in the 1780s, John Adams said to him that he should be concerned about learning wisdom and virtue by reading Sallust and Cicero and Tacitus and Livy, the Roman historians, because it was in this way that he would become, quote, a good man and a useful citizen. And we know that John Adams as well, at the time of the Stamp Act, to which I allude on the last page of your handout, in his own understanding, and John Adams was, as you may know, of the founding fathers, perhaps the most Unitarian, as it were, in spirit. He was the least given to any kind of obvious religious feeling. Thomas Jefferson actually did, as you may know, an edition of the New Testament with passages that he liked. He excerpted those that he didn't agree with, but at least he did an edition of the New Testament. John Adams was not. John Adams was really, as in the sort of Garrison Keillor sense of things, he was very much of a Unitarian. But nevertheless, John Adams wrote at the time of the Stamp Act in 1765, quote, "The liberties of mankind and the glory of human nature is in the keeping of these colonies. America," he went on to say, "was designed by Providence." I'm quoting John Adams. "Designed by Providence for the theater on which man was to make his true figure, on which science, virtue, liberty, happiness, and glory were to exist in peace." A tall order. All right? So John Adams brought to his own participation in the drafting of the Constitution of the United States this particular understanding of his that we were a people who were somehow destined by providence, with a capital P, this is his own capital, his own P, for a special destiny. And even good George Washington, who's not much given to speaking in these terms, described, I'm quoting now from Joseph Ellis's relatively new book, American Creation. He's a fine historian. He's at Mount Holyoke. Some of you may know him, Joseph Ellis. He quotes Washington as describing the North American continent as, quote, a most conspicuous theater which seems to be peculiarly designed by Providence for the display of human greatness and felicity. Right? That's Washington. All right. Now, where do we see all of this? And to further my discussion at this point, I should like to ask you all to, if you have a wallet with you, remove from it a $1 bill. And let's look at the Great Seal of the United States, where so much of this comes into clear expression. So I have a few extras, not too many. Does anyone need a $1 bill? All right, here we go. Anyone else need one? I have a few extras. Anyone else want one? Canadian do? No. We really need Great Seal. You have one, sir? That's 3 I've handed out. That's 3. 2. No, it's 3, damn it all. All right. Here we go. The Great Seal of the United States. Did any of you hear on NPR? Incidentally, a little over a week ago, on All Things Considered, there was an interview with the curator of the Great Seal of the United States. Anyone hear that? Oh, I'm glad. It will make me look good. I thought she was not all that well informed. You know, I mean, honestly, she was the curator of the Great Seal of the United States, and she was interviewed by, I forget, but on All Things Considered, about what the Great Seal, shoot. Well, one of the 2 women, Michelle and, oh, darn. Well, I listened to him. Well, let me tell you a little bit about the Great Seal because it says a lot about what I've been trying to discuss with you. On the very day, believe it or not, of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson constituted themselves as a committee to design the Great Seal of the United States. All right. Okay. Here's what they had in mind. This is charming. This is sweet. Franklin evidently did have a biblical sense of destiny. Right? Here's what he wanted. From Exodus 14. Moses, with his staff, that special staff that God gave him, that great wand or staff, parting the waters of the Red Sea. That would be on the obverse. And on the reverse, Pharaoh in his chariot with his troops being overwhelmed by the waters of the Red Sea. And beneath the device, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. That's Franklin. Okay. Now Jefferson. Jefferson, as it were, sui generis, his own, he too goes back to Exodus. Exodus, in this case, Exodus 13. He wanted, on one side, the Israelites being led out of the wilderness by the cloud by day and the column of fire by night. But on the other side, hear me well, he wanted depicted Hengist and Horsa. I'd never heard of them before myself. Hengist and Horsa, Saxon chiefs. Quote, this is Jefferson, from whom we claim the honor of being descended and whose political principles and form of government we have assumed, close quotation. So I naturally had to look up Hengist and Horsa, and they occur in a text called the Historia Britonum that was drafted around 820 AD and consists of a lot of tales out of which the Arthurian stories were woven. I can say no more than what I've just told you. All right? But that was Jefferson's design. Adams, more classical. Adams was inspired by a French Huguenot artist who'd, in the middle of the 18th century, who'd moved from France to England. His name was Simon Griblin. And he evidently had done an engraving that inspired Adams. And Adams' notion was to represent Hercules with his club, right, being beckoned by virtue to ascend her lofty mountain, on the one hand. On the other, vice, reclining wantonly, as vice must, in her bed of flowers, and beckoning him to assume the charms of persuasion and to be seduced by her person. Well, as you know, no one of these was adopted. So the matter was entrusted to a man named William Barton of Philadelphia, who came up with the notion of the truncated pyramid surmounted by the Eye of Providence. And he initially had imagined for it a Latin device, Deo favente, or favente, that is to say, with God as our fostering or protector, something like that. It's a participle, God with God's protection, God's, all right? Charles Thompson, who was the permanent secretary of the Continental Congress, he worked with Barton, he replaced the Deo favente with what you see now, the Annuit Coeptes, which incidentally, may I say, the Vermont Humanities Council has chosen to title my talk as it has chosen to title my talk. It's really not its real title. The real title is Annuit Coeptes, ancient Roman and American self-invention. But that's Thompson's addition to the seal. And he offers, in addition, a gloss on the meaning of everything on the seal. This is very important for us. So first of all, let's turn to I'll call it the reverse. Let's look at the eagle, all right? The eagle has an escutcheon on its chest, all right? An escutcheon on its chest, which is unsupported. And Thompson says of this that it was designed to denote the fact that the United States would have to rely on their own virtue, all right? Unsupported by others. That's Thompson's gloss. I'm quoting Thompson. There is as well above the eagle's head, as you know, a constellation, and it is designed with 13 stars to indicate that these United States were now a new state, assuming its place among the sovereign powers of the world. The pyramid. Oh, excuse me. Well, you see the olive branches and the arrows. I don't know that I need to comment on those. Peace and war. The eagle can do either. That's quite obvious. And I'll come to the Latin devices, the Latin device in a second. Let's look at the obverse, or it's difficult to know. I've never seen the Great Seal, so I don't know which is the obverse and which is the reverse, frankly. But as you know, one is the obverse and one is the reverse. Those are the terms used on any coin. The truncated pyramid. The pyramid is designed to indicate strength and duration, all right? The eye. Now, many will say that's a Masonic symbol. I know it is that. May I say I've also seen it in rural churches in France where it's not a Masonic symbol. It's God. It's the eye of God. The eye is the eye. It's the eye of providence. Thompson says the eye is meant, quote, to indicate the many signal interpositions of providence in favor of the American cause. All right? Further, at the very base of the pyramid, you will note in Roman numerals 1776. And above, Annuit Coeptes. And I know Frankie will know, but I dare say not too many others will know. This is a quotation taken from the 9th book of Virgil's Aeneid. And it's a little out of context, but it means he, in the case of the context, Jupiter, the chief Roman god, gave his assent to these undertakings. All right? God, or providence, gave its assent to these undertakings. And the undertakings are clearly the American enterprise because the date is given, 1776, and, not to put too fine a point on it, we have at the base of the pyramid, Novus Ordo Cyclorum. That's also taken from Virgil, Virgil's fourth eclogue, which was probably a poem written around 39 BC to commemorate the birth of a child of the consul Asinius Pollio. But it was interpreted in the early Christian Middle Ages to be an unwitting expression of Virgil's sense of the coming of Christ. All right, so it's laden with significance, at least in the Christian Middle Ages. But it means in Latin, the new order of the ages. So this American enterprise, favored by the eye of providence, beginning in 1776, is initiating the new order of the ages. Go back, if you will, to what I quoted from Virgil's Aeneid, Book 1, and the prophecy made by Jupiter to Venus, all right? If we go back to the eagle now, you'll see above in the eagle's beak is another device in Latin, e pluribus unum, which we all know because we see that on all coins. That too comes from a poem of Virgil's, Virgil's Moratum, a minor poem, a poem that no one reads, and for good reason. And I don't know whether you'll be happy or unhappy to learn that it's used in a context in which a bucolic figure is making a kind of crude pesto with a mortar and a pestle. He's crushing, believe it or not, cheese, a kind of ancient Parmesan, cheese, garlic cloves, and salt. And the author says, out of the many, I'm telling you the truth, out of the many, one will emerge, this little pesto. Well, I mean, it's not, Virgil doesn't call it pesto, but you understand it's a kind of pesto. Well, but my point is, it means what it means, but it, of course, is appropriate, naturally, to what we see of those 13 bars and stripes on the escutcheon and the 13 stars in the constellation. So it has a lofty ring in its context on the seal, but it does have a homely origin. All right? So you may put these away, if you will, and I'll take them back from you before I lose them.
Thank you, everyone.
I'm a retired person now on a fixed income. Now, what I want to conclude with is the ways in which we, this curious amalgam of influences, the Roman, from the ancient Israelites, and then, of course, with a strong admixture, as you know, of the deism, that was the principal religious point of view of our founding fathers, how all of this then begins to find its expression in subsequent American history, for better and for worse. I think this is what we as Americans have to consider. That to the extent that this cultural and spiritual heritage from the ancient Israelites and the Romans gives us a sense that we too, or at least, as it were, warrants for us a sense that we too are a chosen people with a special providential design, and I hope I have made that clear enough to you. How does this express itself? And I'll leave it to you to determine what are its most immediate current expressions, this whole notion of American exceptionalism. I dare to speak in those terms because this is Vermont, it's not Texas. But let me just look at how Lyman Beecher sees this. So he's on that sheet. Lyman Beecher, the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was sent out to Cincinnati, Ohio in the early 1830s to found a great seminary. And he sees the American West in his text, A Plea for the West, in terms that allow him to speak very, very confidently of this special destiny. So I'm quoting from his Plea for the West. Quote, just a couple of quotations. It was the opinion of Edwards, he's referring to Jonathan Edwards and the Great Awakening of the 1740s, that the millennium would commence in America. When I first encountered this opinion, I thought it chimerical. But all providential developments since and all the existing signs of the times lend corroboration to it. And further, quote, but if this nation is, in the providence of God, destined to lead the way in the moral and political emancipation of the world, just do listen, because, as one says in Latin, mutatis mutandis, making appropriate changes for modern times. I do submit to you that we do have, in the course of the past years, heard rhetoric that's not all that different. The language is not all that different. All right? But if this nation is, in the providence of God, destined to lead the way in the moral and political emancipation of the world, it is time she understood her high calling and were harnessed for the work. And I conclude in my quotations from Beecher, the West is a young empire of mind and power and wealth and free institutions rushing up to a giant manhood with a rapidity and a power never before witnessed below the sun. And if she carries with her the elements of her preservation, the experiment will be glorious, the joy of the nation, the joy of the whole earth, as she rises in the majesty of her intelligence and benevolence and enterprise for the emancipation of the world, a grand design. So much for Lyman Beecher and his plea for the West. Let me turn to someone who's, I think you will agree, slightly less attractive in his understanding of this legacy that comes out of these founding impulses. This is William Gilmore Simms, who was a novelist living in South Carolina. And I quote now from a letter he wrote to the senator from South Carolina, James Hammond, in 1847, on the eve of the Mexican War. I quote, "You must not dilate against military glory. War is the greatest element of modern civilization, and, this is appropriate, our destiny is conquest." Think of what Jupiter said to Venus. I give them empire without end. All right? Our destiny is conquest. Indeed, the moment a nation ceases to extend its sway as it falls a prey, if it falls a prey to an inferior but more energetic neighbor, the Mexicans are in the condition of those whom God seeks to destroy, having first made mad. They are doing their best to compel us to conquer them. That's William Gilmore Simms. That's a little, I recognize it's a little heavy. Now, how about Stephen Douglas? This is in the debates, one of the debates of 1858 with Abraham Lincoln, in which Douglas was offering an argument that was an apology for maintaining slavery. Quote, "Let each state stand firmly by that great constitutional right. Let each state mind its own business and let its neighbors alone, and there will be no trouble on this question. If we will stand by that principle, then Mr. Lincoln will find that this republic can exist forever divided into free and slave states, as our fathers made it and the people of each state have decided. Stand by that great principle, and we can go on, as we have done, increasing in wealth, in population, in power, and in all the elements of greatness until we shall be the admiration and terror of the world. We can go on and enlarge as our population increases, and we require more room until we make this continent one ocean-bound republic. Under that principle, the United States can perform that great mission, that destiny, which Providence has marked out for us." That's Douglas. On the other hand, I think rather more benignly, if I may say so, Abraham Lincoln, in his Thanksgiving proclamation of October 3, 1863, in which he makes the following allusions, and I quote just a few phrases from that. He says, "To these bounties," this is the beginning of his proclamation, "which we are so constantly enjoyed that we are prone to forget the source from which they come, others have been added which are of so extraordinary a nature that they cannot fail to penetrate and soften even the heart which is habitually insensible to the ever watchful providence of Almighty God." All right? And later in the same text, he says, "No human counsel hath devised, nor hath any mortal hand worked out." Notice, incidentally, the nature of the language there, which is willfully, deliberately biblical. People did not, in 1863, speak that way. "Worked out these great things, they are the gracious gifts of the Most High God, who, while dealing with us in anger for our sins, hath nevertheless remembered mercy." And he concludes by enjoining us all to fervently implore the interposition of the Almighty hand to heal the wounds of the nation and to restore it as soon as may be consistent with the divine purposes to the full enjoyment of peace, harmony, tranquility, and union. And I conclude with just a couple of bits of statistical information that I picked up from a talk given at Dartmouth a couple of years ago by a distinguished scholar from Ohio State. He's the senior fellow at the Mershon Center for the Study of International Security at Ohio State, which incidentally is a highly reputable institute. It's not, it's a serious, Ohio State is an enormous university. And I think in terms of undergraduate education, that probably leaves a lot to be desired in terms of what, let's say, someone could do at UVM. But in this particular Mershon Institute, it does bring together a galaxy of remarkable scholars. So Stefan, this fellow, Alexander Stefan, came to Dartmouth, gave a talk in which he was interested in the Left Behind Christian fiction series. I don't know how many of you know about that. I don't know much about it other than what I read about it, but it is apparently, after Harry Potter, the bestseller in America. So it's very popular. Right? And Mershon goes on to say that there are polls that demonstrate, and we all know this, Americans are a believing people. 97% of Americans believe in God. 82%, according to Mershon, consider that God very important in their lives. It's a very high percentage. If you travel in Europe, even in the so-called old-fashioned Catholic countries, I assure you, God is largely dead. So America is quite exceptional in that regard. More to the point for our discussion, and I'm going to end with this. He notes that 48% of Americans continue to believe that the United States is under a special protection from God. Well, I will stop there. My hope is that there may be some discussion about this, but what I've sought to bring to your attention is not only the sources, some of the sources that converge to help us better understand our own peculiar history of ourselves, our sense of ourselves as enjoying an unusual providential dispensation that remains very vigorous and very much alive today. And as you know, part of the mission that the current administration in Washington carries with it is that we should be bringing democracy to the world. There's a mission there. And it's for us to know whether we actually do have that mission, do you see? And whether it's a mission that at sometimes can work its way toward remarkably generous and helpful effects. And I think in that regard, frankly, of the Marshall Plan, which I don't suggest was an entirely unselfish enterprise. But its design, though, even if it helped us, was enormously beneficial to helping others. And so I would suggest that out of this curious heritage that we enjoy, there has been a legacy that has sometimes been used for enormous good, but sometimes as well, I think, has blinded us to thinking that we are indeed somehow set apart from the rules that apply to others, and that this notion of exceptionalism may not be altogether helpful, if I may say so, in a somewhat muted way. But those are my remarks to you this evening. Thank you for your patience. Questions, if you have any questions, yeah. Yes, sir.
Not a question, but, and I'll forgive you for this being your first visit to Middlebury. But in the years past, we, as a town, celebrated Forefathers' Day. It's died down now.
Yeah.
It's just
When? What time? In the 4th of July? Or
no,
when?
it was, as I recall, in the early fall. But,
It was around Thanksgiving.
I see. Well, it'd be good, it would be a good thing to do, above all, if you were marked by, talks and discussions about who the forefathers were and what they actually thought about what they were doing and what we should be doing. I think we tend to forget an awful lot of that. And
I went to several of them, and they may have done that originally.
Yeah.
It started really early,
Yeah.
but usually three people spoke on any subject they wished to speak on, and it was the community was invited to have dinner.
That's nice. That's a nice one.
It was nice.
Yes, sir.
I don't know how to put this, but I'll start. I'm in the middle of reading Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, as well as something called The Culture of Make-Believe by Derek Jensen. Remember both of these?
No.
I've been learning something about slavery.
Yeah.
And I'm astonished, actually, to learn to what extent the country that we have now has been built upon
Yeah.
slavery, and for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
It's an astonishing thing that
Yeah.
continues to come out
Yeah.
more and more, as was, I think, the Roman.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
as well.
Oh, absolutely.
That this lofty kind of
Yeah.
thinking, the time made available for the people to write these kinds of things and think like this, made possible that way. And I wonder, psychologically, if this arrogance was kind of required by that origin, that juxtaposition of the people. You'd have to have a certain kind of attitude. It's a lie.
Let's see. Well, the Greeks also.
Yeah,
Ancient
yeah.
Greece was a slave-owning society, and they weren't troubled by that. But they, on the other hand, neither did they have that same kind of sense of themselves as being chosen by the gods for a special destiny. So I don't know. I mean, everything you said, I agree with it. I'm reading, incidentally, a book that was brought to my attention recently. I gave a lecture at Bates College a few weeks ago, and about reconciliation, and I quoted liberally from Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's book, The Passing of the Armies, the great hero of Little Round Top at Gettysburg. And this woman, who's an Irish historian, said, if you read David Blight's book, Race and Culture, the Civil War in American Memory, and it's about everything that wasn't achieved by the emancipation of blacks in the Civil War, and how he begins by referring to the 50th anniversary celebration of the Battle of Gettysburg, to which President Woodrow Wilson went, and there was great celebrations, and everyone was so pleased with the reconciliation between the Rebs and the Yankees. The only blacks there were servants. And this was the time when the Jim Crow laws were, just at their most ferocious. Well, and I recommend that book. It's a stiff book. It's a thick, hot. No. David Blight, B-L-I-G-H-T. He's an historian at Yale. What did I say? Race and Culture, the Civil War in American Memory. Yeah. But, so you made a very good point, except I don't think that one can make a direct correlation between slavery and Roman society, or for that matter, our own. At least I don't know quite how that can be made. But it's a troubling matter, and it reminds us of how far we still, in some ways, have to go in this society.
Well, these are things we haven't been taught.
Yeah, no. So acknowledgement is the first, step. I agree with you entirely. I agree. Yeah.
Madam President,
Yes.
did the English have this sense of destiny in the 19th century
No.
when they had the British Empire?
Not divine destiny. Cultural destiny. I mean, cultural superiority, but not that it was, so far as I know, that England was somehow favored by God to impose its rule upon the world, but that British civilization was superior. I think that comes out of the Christian Middle Ages and the Crusades and beyond. That there was a sense that white Europeans had a missionary task to accomplish, but not because God asked them, but because they felt that they just knew better. It's a question of degree, I would say. But if you look at that, the dollar bill is instructive in that regard, because the Great Seal says a lot, and it is remarkable to think of the pyramid with those Latin devices that say history begins in these United States. And to give it weight and legitimacy, it's in Latin. I mean, it's very interesting, you say. It's in Latin. So it's, of course, the pyramid as being associated with ancient Egypt. And in antiquity, even in antiquity, the Egyptians were seen by the Romans and even by the Greeks, if one reads Herodotus' histories, as being somehow the founders of civilization and the founders of the relationship that human beings enjoyed with gods. that the Egyptians were the first to understand this. So that pyramid is symbolic of, it's a symbolic reference to the very beginning of things. Yes, sir?
Well, I have another thought. Isn't it true that a sign of learning throughout the British Isles was the ability to speak Latin? And
Well,
so-
certainly they've already studied Latin, classics. Oh, absolutely, classical education, absolutely.
So maybe it's not so
Yeah.
surprising that Latin was.
No, but you see John Quincy, no, not John Quincy, but John Adams felt essentially the same thing. You may know, those of you who read the John Adams book by McCulloch, all instruction at the University of Leiden, when John Quincy Adams was there, was in Latin. All courses of instruction were in Latin. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering, because I've been doing some genealogical work, and you mentioned about the covenants.
Yes.
In the very
Yes.
early times. Were there a bunch of different covenants, and were they written by, men of the church, or?
That's a good question. You know who's very good, and I don't know that I'm in an awfully good position to answer that. Although there were agreements, and everything was based upon agreement. And of course, they go back to the covenants that God makes with Noah and with Abraham and with Jacob and with Moses. So that whole covenantal relationship. Gary Wills has a new book called Head and Heart, a study of American Christianities. It's a recent book. Do you know Gary Wills? He's probably the liveliest intellectual historian working in America today. Yeah. Have you seen that? Have you seen that yourself? Yeah. It's a wonderful book. Yeah, and he talks about he may speak specifically to that notion of the formal covenant documents, but yes, there were contracts and documents that people signed.
People had to sign them.
Yes. It wasn't just enough to say, I want to join the church.
Right.
There was a ceremony. There was an examination of the worthiness of the person and so on. Yeah.
Okay, and then I just wanted to go on to something else.
Yes.
Because there was an interesting article, and I can't remember if it was in the Burlington Press or the As an Independent, but he was talking about exactly what you were talking about: Jefferson, Washington, Adams, blah blah blah.
Yes.
And how they were more deists.
Oh, they're all deists, yeah.
Than the the Jesus part.
Yes. No.
Yeah, which was very interesting. That
No. Apparently, there were. I'm trying to think. I just saw a reference to this recently. Some divine during the Revolutionary period was extremely critical of Washington for not being a more active churchgoer. Yeah. So they were not active churchgoers.
When did the time between, the Puritans
Yeah.
that were such Christians?
Yes.
And.
The Enlightenment.
and
The 70s. They just these
what,
people.
100 years later?
Yeah. The people.
Right.
These were people who had been educated.
Was that because of education and
The
knowing
Enlightenment, the
Latin
European
instead?
Enlightenment, and its effects on the education of these very bright Americans. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I think that the sense of the founding fathers generally being deists has been exaggerated, especially in recent times. I've done a lot of research over the last 30, 40 years. And when I was in the Army in Alexandria, Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C., I had the great honor on many occasions of sitting in the very same pew where Washington sat very regularly in the church in Alexandria. He was there at least every couple of weeks he was there when he wasn't out fighting the British or whatever. He was a very busy man. He was very rarely at home. He was very frequently at that church. They even have a document.
Lincoln went to church with his wife, yeah. It doesn't necessarily follow, as you know. I mean, they were criticized. I know Washington was criticized for not going to church enough, but that doesn't mean it doesn't necessarily follow, as we all know, that to be a church goer is also to be. That's all. No. Well, no. Touche. No. Yeah, no. Yes, sir.
I've always admired John Winthrop's classic statement, "We shall be as a city upon a
Yes.
hill." I had family that later settled in Connecticut in the 1640s.
Yes.
And can't help but feel they were drawn, they were Puritans, and they must have...
From Massachusetts, coming out of Massachusetts?
No,
or
they're
settled,
from England.
then they settled immediately
Sheffield,
in
Jessops, and they settled in Connecticut.
Yeah.
And I can't help but feel that they were drawn.
Oh, no, it's the same. I happen to be from New Haven, Connecticut.
I mean, I
And
feel
New Haven
it's
was
the
a
same.
covenant. It was a covenant society. People who went there in 1638 were members of a covenanted group. And as you may know, this is remarkable. The Congregationalist Church remained in Connecticut the established church until, what's your guess? 1818. Nearly 50 years after not quite, you see, 1818. And in Massachusetts, I think the Congregational Church remained the established church for a little longer. So these were covenanted societies, and yes, I mean, there's a part of me. I come from I was from that same background. There's something charming about that, and I think it can be, frankly, I think it can be, as one says in today's language, empowering. That is to say, I think it can help us all to feel there's something more to our responsibility as human beings and citizens than merely paying our taxes and voting and so on. So I think that Puritan heritage and what is implied also in the Great Seal, that those are legacies, as I tried to suggest, as interpreted by Abraham Lincoln, that can be channeled creatively and constructively. I happen to disagree privately when that same legacy is translated into a sense that somehow we are not bound by the same rules by which the rest of the world is bound, and that we have a mission to correct the mistakes made by others willy-nilly. I say no more.
Well, thank you, Mr. Bradley.
Yeah. Thank you.
Stay a few minutes afterwards and answer any more questions.
Oh, yeah,
I
I'm-
want to remind everybody, our next program in this series is April 2nd, and it's going to be on the great camps of the Adirondacks. Hope to see you then.